The pandemic has deeply altered how we experience time. I'm sure I'm not alone when I wake up most days and wonder, what day is it today? Days stretch on endlessly from Zoom meeting to Zoom meeting, while weeks are suddenly over in a flash. Events that occurred just months ago seem like lifetimes ago. To put it in the language of classical anthropology, the time of disaster that we have been living in has been a protracted time of liminality, a period of uncertainty after previous structures of life have been upended, but new stable structures have yet to form. Social media users call it more simply Blursday. Even as we ask ourselves, what will the new normal be like after this is all over? We do have an idea of what will follow this liminal disaster time. In significant ways, Blursday is not an interruption of the normal time in which we used to live, but rather an acceleration of what media theorist Jonathan Crary has dubbed 24/7 time, the hallmark of capitalism in the 21st century. 24/7 time seeks to transform all days into Blursday, an uninterrupted and undifferentiated time of consumption made possible by the combination of smart technologies and round-the-clock monetization of our constant interactions with them. Our sense of time is marked by fragmentary digital life worlds with radically different rhythms and speeds that are unsuited for human and non-human flourishing. Crary writes, quote, 24/7 is inseparable from environmental catastrophe in its declaration of permanent expenditure, of endless wastefulness for its sustenance, in its terminal disruption of the cycles and seasons on which ecological integrity depends, end quote. Blursday, whether the general Blursday of late capitalism or the specific Blursday of the COVID-19 pandemic, is not just a new arrangement of time. It is a new temporality, a horizon of meaning by which and through which we experience the temporal dimensions of life. In our current pandemic Blursday, worshippers have found it difficult to maintain a sense of connection with liturgical feasts and seasons. Liturgical time has its own rhythms and liminal moments that can be hard to maintain outside of social gatherings. Yet our present struggle during the pandemic to carve out meaningful time for liturgical feasting and fasting is not new either. It merely reveals with stark clarity a broader struggle to maintain shared connection to liturgical time in the Blursday of 24/7 temporality more generally. In this paper, I will examine liturgical time not as something to be fit into or alongside 24/7 Blursday temporality, but as itself a rival temporality. I argue that a thick sense of liturgical temporality challenges the temporality of disaster/capitalism and its unsustainable way of life. This way of thinking about liturgical time has important implications for religious communities trying to think through post-pandemic worship and what it might look like. I suggest that liturgical feasts and seasons should be not only set back into regular motion in an attempt to return to a pre-pandemic normal, but rather foregrounded and framed as a communal mode of redeeming the time within a deeply damaging global order of consumption, waste, and destruction of communities and environments. Section 1, Blursday, disaster time, late capitalist temporality. The COVID-19 pandemic has given rise to the proliferation of neologisms and new coinages: social distancing, super spreader, doom scrolling, and a favorite among liturgists, Corona Tide. Blursday is not a neologism new to 2020, as it used to mean a day spent hungover. Now it names the inability to determine what day it is, due in large part to social isolation necessitated by virus prevention protocols. In-person social interactions, including religious services, have largely been replaced by virtual ones. And the boundaries between screen and non-screen, home and work, rest and waking, personal time and professional time have significantly eroded. In close conjunction with the onset of this pandemic Blursday, the COVID crisis has spurred on an explosion of new digital life worlds, virtual classrooms, Zoom, new spaces of streaming and retail, etc., thus accelerating a trend that had already been a hallmark of 21st century 24/7 temporality. These new and enhanced digital habitations have made the pace of consumption, as well as environmental degradation, proceed uninhibited by an arrangement of time that might restrict it because of shared times of rest or vacation, for example. Indeed, large tech and retail corporations like Amazon and Google have taken full advantage of the digitalization of life in the pandemic, posting record numbers throughout. Much of the seemingly temporary measures will likely remain after the pandemic is over. For example, many businesses have already put in place post-pandemic plans for work from home options in efforts to save money on office space and accommodate potential employees who have gotten used to the flexibility afforded by working from home. While modern market forces have always sought ways to extract the most profit from limited time and resources through organizing time, Jonathan Crary argues that 24/7 temporality in the 21st century is something genuinely new, an overarching structure for the experience of time, which, quote, can be characterized as a generalized inscription of human life into duration without breaks, defined by a principle of continuous functioning. It is a time that no longer passes beyond clock time, end quote. Smart technologies have created new rhythms, speeds, and formats through which actions can be easily streamlined and monetized, even actions as simple as resting one's eyeballs on an image on the screen of a smartphone. 24/7 temporality is not simply a continuous capture of one's attention, however, but rather a dense layering of time in which multiple things, ads, clicks, tweets, embedded in a single visual temporal space can be attended to in a nearly simultaneous instant. This continuous now seems ever new, yet digitally mediated novel experiences are increasingly interchangeable, despite their different content. The paradoxically repetitive newness of digitally mediated interactions with the world, Crary argues, encourages practices that are indifferent to past or future horizons. We hold out the false hope that one more click might open up something genuinely new to counter the monotony in which we are immersed, but alas, it is not meant to be. However, media theorist Nadine Chan sees a flicker of hope in the explosion of new digital life worlds with their own microtemporalities in the pandemic. In a very recent article, she points to how the lockdowns necessitated by the 2-week incubation period of the coronavirus created the possibility of a, quote, collective, explosive, revolutionary time, end quote, witnessed this past summer in the Black Lives Matter resurgence in the US and throughout the world. Chan writes, quote, amid the energies of collective action, digital asynchrony may also be the path towards inhabited futures that are not so digital. That is, if we can learn to be contemporaneous together, end quote. Chan is cautiously optimistic that out of the proliferation of disjunctive digital temporalities, a reimagination of a shared future could occur, one that could stand in resistance to the destructive practices and demands of 24/7 temporality and encourage solidarity with and among marginalized communities most at risk. How might today's fragmented microtemporalities converge around a shared purpose and future? Philosopher Maurice Blanchot, writing about disaster time, notes that while the fragmentation of time amidst disaster does not necessarily breed instability, it also does not allow for fixity, but rather, quote, disarray and confusion, end quote. Disarray and confusion may be the perfect descriptors of any given individual's social media feed today. Crary believes that the multiplication of new digital life worlds is ineffective as a mode of solidarity and resistance to 24/7 temporality, since, quote, overlaid onto them are all the practices of individual time management made possible by 24/7 networks and markets, end quote. Because of the market's demand for homogeneity and substitutability, 24/7 temporality is incompatible with, quote, any social behaviors that have a rhythmic pattern of action and pause. This would include any social exchange involving sharing, reciprocity, or cooperation, end quote. In other words, shared praxis often comes from shared temporality. And so the fragmented microtemporalities of new digital life worlds will likely remain at the mercy of Blursday long after the pandemic is over. Section 2, Liturgical Temporality against Blursday. For anyone interested in combating the destruction and fragmentation of 24/7 temporality, Nadine Chan's question, can we learn to be contemporaneous together, merits serious consideration. Against the background of 24/7 temporality's hostility to practices of rest and reciprocity, it's easy to understand why some recent Christian theologians have framed liturgical time as a form of resistance. Old Testament scholar Walter Brueggemann is perhaps the most well-known modern theorist of the Sabbath, which he defines as a kind of, quote, visible insistence that our lives are not defined by the production and consumption of commodity goods, end quote. For Brueggemann, the present order is the order of Pharaoh, and the Sabbath is how the people of God witness to higher values than those insatiable urges of the market. Liberation theologian Daniel Castillo has recently expanded on Brueggemann's theorization of the Sabbath. He writes that Sabbath practices continuously challenge the community to, quote, maintain its prophetic edge in negotiating with the globalization project's ways of organizing creation, end quote. Sabbath practices are necessary to achieve the goals of discipleship and solidarity with the poor and the earth, because such a difficult commitment must be constantly renewed. Castillo argues that Sabbath should go hand in hand with solidarity with the poor and the earth, discernment of the times in order to clarify the shape of religious praxis, gathering in community as a witness against the, quote, fragmenting and isolating mechanisms, quote, of late capitalism, and celebration and joyful hope of God's victory over the power of sin and death. In the absence of shared concrete liturgical practices of Sabbath in most religious communities, Brueggemann and other modern theorists of the Sabbath champion spontaneous practices of rest and reflection, even napping, as forms of resistance to 24/7 Blursday temporality, clogging its gears, as it were. However, such a fill-in-the-blank modern notion of Sabbath, all but untethered to concrete forms and strategies of communal praxis, fails, in my opinion, to sufficiently address the all-encompassing nature of 24/7 temporality. Beyond the important but admittedly limited notion of rest, modern theories of the Sabbath have not articulated a true liturgical temporality, that is, a horizon for the experience of time and its organization, with a sense of shared past and future, which could then have a shared praxis and shared goals. How might we articulate a more robust and concrete liturgical temporality that could preserve some of the important ideals of the Sabbath as a mode of resistance to 24/7 temporality? In her recent book, Welcoming Finitude Toward a Phenomenology of Orthodox Liturgy, philosopher Christina Geschwantner argues that a thick liturgical temporality, such as that which is practiced in some Orthodox Christian communities, has the possibility to shape communities into being contemporaneous together in ways that challenge the homogenizing temporality of Blursday. Drawing from a number of phenomenologists, especially Martin Heidegger, Geschwantner argues the ways in which articulates the ways in which liturgical time becomes meaningful for individuals and worshiping communities. She describes liturgical temporality thus: instead of a linear experience that moves from past through the present to the future, time is experienced as the horizon within which we experience our liturgical being. It is the how of our being in its world. In the liturgical experience, the temporality of the liturgy serves as the horizon for our experience, end quote. What does this temporality feel like, and how might it contrast and resist 24/7 temporality? Let me mention 3 ways. First is the status of the present. Blursday is concerned with the now as a constant jumping from one thing to the next, a response to new digitally mediated stimuli. But it is a now that is disconnected to what came before and from what might come next. In liturgical temporality, the now, or the today, is also a constant focus. But the liturgical today is a now that is subject to past and future. Past and future are present within it. Geschwantner writes, quote, the liturgical present is only given meaningfully if it is precisely given at the same time and within the same moment as memory and anticipation. This sense of the link of the present with the past and future is felt especially on major feasts such as the Nativity of Christ. One of the main Orthodox Christian hymns for the feast reads, quote, today the Virgin gives birth to the transcendent one, and the earth offers a cave to the unapproachable one. Angels with shepherds glorify him. The wise men journey with a star, since for our sake the eternal God was born as a little child. In liturgical temporality, now is a moment of time immemorial, which is nevertheless new for me and colors my experience. Geschwantner writes, quote, each moment matters profoundly, not as one in sequences of nows, but as the moment that encapsulates all of time. The heightened moment of the feast then is in some way infects all of time, bleeds into the ordinary and gives it significance, unquote. Second, the temporality embodied in a hymn like the one I just read throws the individual into a shared story that is shaped by the events in salvation history that is in some sense still happening. Unlike Blursday's obsession with novelty and the creation of new digital life worlds, in liturgical temporality, quote, we are no longer the ones who opened the world, but become dispossessed, swallowed up in the larger story, unquote. Liturgical time is meaningful for us precisely because we did not invent it. As an illustration of this, Geschwantner turns to the period of Holy Week, the days before Pascha or Easter, as a particularly intense experience of being contemporaneous together. She writes, even in small parishes, one can spend hours and hours in church, and going to all or even many of the services wreaks havoc on one's normal schedule. One enters into a different kind of temporality where regular time seems suspended. Unquote. This time matters more than other times and is felt as such because of the sense of the anticipation of a true feast, which requires time-intensive preparation of fasting, prayer, cooking, cleaning, and is colored by the memory of past feasting. Paradoxically, liturgical temporality neither constitutes a radical rupture with our everyday lives, nor fits neatly within a separate temporality. Rather, it embraces all of time, lays claim to it, and grants meaning to it year after year. This brings me to the third and final way liturgical temporality resists 24/7 temporality, repetition. As I mentioned earlier, Blursday, for all its obsession with novelty, is often reduced to a kind of repetition of new experiences that are, for all intents and purposes, interchangeable. This repetition, in the words of Blanchot, is, quote, neither mournful nor nostalgic, the undesired return, the destruction of the present, unquote. Rather than the endless repetition of novelty, liturgical repetition, the weekly and annual cycle of fasts and feasts and commemorations, is phenomenologically how communities make another world my world in an act of self-dispossession, allowing it to mold common life. This is an ongoing process and one in which success is never really promised. We go through Lent every year and are never finished with it. We live within the tension of sinner saint, waiting for an ultimate redemption that transcends even liturgical temporality. Conclusion. One of the reasons worshiping on Blursday during this pandemic is so difficult is because the 24/7 temporality of late capitalism resists the practices of rest, reciprocity, and solidarity. But as I have argued, a robust articulation of liturgical temporality shows that it is not just about a Sabbath rest, but also about the creative tension between remembrance and anticipation, preparation and celebration, anamnesis and hope. This multifaceted and yet unified temporality, to quote Daniel Castillo, quote, undercuts the ideological homogenization of time and instead foregrounds the community's hope in the power of God to redeem history, unquote. Laying claim to all time, liturgical temporality allows for time of discernment, to see what is happening and adjust praxis, and invite worshiping communities to act in solidarity with those people and ecologies most at risk in the brutality of Blursday temporality writ large. It also shows that merely political strategies of resistance, important as they are incomplete. What is the nature of this resistance then? To cite Blanchot, it is spiritual resistance, a resistance without which political resistance is empty. And I'll conclude this paper by quoting Blanchot. Resistance has no meaning, if not simply for oneself or for the sake of friendship, which is rare. Only the religious have firm conviction capable of giving significance to life and to death. Thus, resistance is spiritual. Not until the revolts issuing from the depths do perspectives open, do ruined words become audible, rising from the ruins, traversing the silence. Thank you.